daughter-in-law set the cup of tea in front of me that evening the way you'd set food down for a stray cat. Careful, distant, like she wasn't sure if I'd bite. And my son, sitting across the table from her, didn't look up from his phone. Not once. He just said it. Quietly, casually. Casually. The way you'd comment on the weather. Mom, you know we're not charging you anything to live here. That was all. 6 words. And the entire table went still. My granddaughter, 9 years old, kept eating her macaroni. She didn't understand what had just happened, but I did, and my son's wife did. She looked down at her plate and something in the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Just a flicker. I didn't say a word. I picked up the tea. I took 1 sip. And then I excused myself, said I was tired, and walked down the hallway to the bedroom they'd given me, the one with the window that faced the side of the neighbor's garage. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. Then I picked up my phone and found the number I'd saved 6 months ago and never used. "Raymond," I said when he answered. "I think I need to come in." That was the beginning of the end of my silence, and the beginning of something else entirely. "My name is Helen. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school English in the same district where I grew up, and for most of those years, I believed I had built something solid. A home. A family. A marriage that weathered things most marriages don't. My husband Gerald and I were married for 38 years. He was a civil engineer, quiet and methodical. The kind of man who read instruction manuals for pleasure and kept every tax return in a fireproof box in the closet. He was not romantic in the conventional sense. He didn't bring flowers, but he called me every day when he was traveling for work, without fail, from 1987 until the year he died. That kind of consistency is its own language. We raised 1 son, his name is Kevin. He was a good boy mostly. Curious, a little stubborn, better at sports than at sitting still. Kevin grew up in a brick colonial outside of Richmond, Virginia, with a yard big enough to kick a ball around and a father who coached his little league team for 5 seasons, even though Gerald was, by his own admission, absolutely hopeless at baseball. Kevin went to Virginia Tech, studied business, graduated with a degree and the confidence that sometimes outpaced his experience. He met his wife Stephanie at a work conference in Charlotte. They married when he was 30. They had a daughter named Piper, and then 3 years later another daughter named June. For a long time, everything moved forward the way life is supposed to. Steadily, quietly, with enough joy in the small things that you don't notice how much is also quietly changing. Gerald died on a Wednesday morning in March. He was 67. He had gone out to the garage to get a snow brush. We'd had an unexpected late frost, and he simply didn't come back inside. The paramedic said he was likely gone before he hit the floor. Massive cardiac event. No warning, no time. I stood in the driveway, my bathrobe holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I watched them load a stretcher into an ambulance, and I understood something I had never fully understood before, that the ordinary morning you're living through can become, in less than 3 minutes, the morning you will spend the rest of your life measuring everything else against. The first year after Gerald died, I stayed in the house in Richmond. My sister drove up from Roanoke twice a month. Friends from school dropped by. Kevin called every few days, then every week, then less as the months passed and life, as it does, resumed its ordinary pace for everyone except the person who was left behind. The second winter was harder. The furnace needed replacing. A pipe froze and burst in the basement. The yard that Gerald had kept trim every Sunday began to look ragged by October. I was managing, but managing is not the same as living, and I think somewhere in that distinction is where things began to slowly shift. Kevin brought it up for the first time at Thanksgiving. We were sitting at the table after dinner. The girls were watching a movie in the other room, and he leans back in his chair the way Gerald used to and said, "Mom, we've been thinking. You shouldn't be rattling around that big house by yourself." Stephanie was beside him. She nodded in the careful way she had of agreeing with things without quite committing to them. I'm fine, I said. Kevin said they had a finished room downstairs. Good natural light. Its own bathroom. It would be easier, he said, for everyone. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 4 months. And then the pipe in the upstairs bathroom went, and the estimate for the repair was $3,000, and I was 63 years old and sitting alone in a house that felt like a coat 2 sizes too large, and I thought, maybe easier is not such a bad thing. I sold the Richmond house in April. Kevin helped with the listings and the paperwork. He was efficient and organized about it. He gets that from Gerald. And when the closing was done, he offered to help manage the proceeds. So you don't have to worry about it, he said. I'll set up an account and make sure it's working for you. I trusted him completely. He was my son. By May, I had moved into the downstairs room in their house in Cary, North Carolina. Kevin and Stephanie had bought it 3 years before. 4 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a neighborhood with a homeowners association, and a newsletter. It was a nice house, clean, organized. The kind of house that requires regular maintenance and a spreadsheet to run. The first few weeks felt like visiting. The girls were thrilled to have me there. Piper, who was 11, liked to sit in my room after school and show me things on her tablet. June, who was 7, had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, and she had a great deal to say on the subject. Those afternoons in early summer were genuinely sweet. I reminded myself I was lucky. But houses have rhythms. And the rhythm of Kevin and Stephanie's house, I began to understand, had been established long before I arrived. Meals happened at specific times. Groceries followed a specific system. The dishwasher was loaded a specific way. None of this was unreasonable. It was her home. But slowly, week by week, the accommodations I made to fit into that rhythm began to add up. I stopped using the kitchen in the afternoons because Stephanie preferred to start dinner prep by 4. I started doing my laundry only on Sundays because she'd once mentioned, carefully and politely, that weekday energy rates were something to consider. I stopped offering to pick up the girls from school after Stephanie mentioned, equally carefully, that she liked to know the plan in advance. Each individual adjustment was small. Together they formed something larger, a shape. The shape of a woman who had slowly stopped taking up space. Kevin was busy. He worked long hours, traveled for client meetings, came home tired. Our conversations at dinner were brief and pleasant and told me very little about how he was actually doing. When I asked, he said fine. I believed him because I wanted to. It was a Tuesday evening in October when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had gone to bed early with a headache. Around 10, I woke up thirsty, got up for a glass of water, and walked partway down the hallway before I heard their voices from the living room. Low, careful. The way people talk when they believe the house is asleep. The numbers don't work the way we planned, Stephanie was saying. Kevin sighed. I know. The Henderson project fell through. And the quarterly review, I know, Steph. A pause. The account from the Richmond sale, she said. There's enough there. If we restructured, Kevin's voice was lower. That's her money. It would be managed for the family, Stephanie said. She doesn't need to be involved in every decision. I stood very still in the hallway. My water glass was in my hand and I had stopped breathing. She trusts me, Kevin said. Exactly, Stephanie replied. I went back to my room without the water. I lay in the dark for a long time, looking at the ceiling. Kevin's voice when he said that, the confidence in it, the word exactly from Stephanie. I replayed those 4 seconds over and over until they stopped sounding like a conversation between my son and his wife and started sounding like a plan. The next morning, I said nothing. I poured myself coffee, helped June find her backpack, and sat at the kitchen table while the ordinary morning moved around me like water around a stone. But something inside me had become very alert. Over the next few weeks, I began paying attention in ways I hadn't before. The mail. I noticed I hadn't seen any statements from the account Kevin had set up from the Richmond sale. When I mentioned it once, casually, Kevin said he'd handle any paperwork. You don't need to track every statement, he said. That's what I'm here for. I nodded and let it go. But I started checking the mailbox myself in the mornings before Kevin left for work. 3 times in 2 weeks, I found it already empty at 7:45. He'd gotten there first. And then I remembered something. 6 months after Gerald died, I had met with a man named Raymond Albright. Gerald had insisted on it, back when he was still alive. He'd said, sitting at the kitchen table one Sunday afternoon entirely out of nowhere, if something happens to me, call Raymond before you call anyone else. I had laughed and told him he was being morbid. He had smiled and written the number on a card and put it in the small drawer in my bedside table, where I kept things I didn't want to lose. Raymond Albright was a financial advisor and estate planner. He had worked with Gerald for years on retirement planning, some investments, and, I would later learn, something Gerald had arranged without fully explaining to me. When I finally called him that evening after the comment at the dinner table, he asked me to come into his office. I told Kevin I was meeting an old friend for lunch. I drove 40 minutes to Raymond's office in Durham, which occupied a quiet suite above a pharmacy on a tree-lined street. He was waiting for me at the door. "Helen," he said, "Gerald told me you'd call. I just didn't know when." Raymond was a compact, careful man with reading glasses. He pushed up his nose when he was thinking. He had known Gerald for over 20 years. Gerald trusted him with the kind of quiet certainty that didn't need explaining. We sat down. I told him what I'd overheard. I told him about the Richmond account. I told him about the mail. Raymond listened without interrupting. Then he opened a drawer and removed a folder. "Gerald arranged something before he died," he said. "He didn't tell you the details because he said, and I'm quoting him here, that you would worry, and he didn't want you to spend whatever time you had left together worrying." He placed a document on the desk between us. Gerald had, in the last 2 years of his life, established what Raymond called a revocable living trust, the Helen and Gerald Marsh Family Trust. It had been structured, Raymond explained, specifically to protect my financial independence. The Richmond house had been the primary asset. The proceeds from its sale were still legally under trust governance. I stared at the document. "Kevin has been managing an account from the sale," I said. Raymond nodded. "He has access to certain funds. Gerald authorized a discretionary account for Kevin, standard distributions up to a limit. Reasonable expenses." He paused. "Nothing beyond that." "Meaning what?" Raymond tapped to the folder. "Any restructuring, transfer, or reallocation of trust principal requires written authorization from you, the primary beneficiary." I sat back in my chair. "Has Kevin requested anything like that?" Raymond looked at me steadily. "Not through me, but I've seen some preliminary documentation from a financial institution in Charlotte suggesting a transfer inquiry was initiated approximately 6 weeks ago." My stomach tightened. "Initiated by whom?" "The request was submitted under Kevin's authority as a co-trustee." Raymond removed his glasses. "Helen, the request was for a significant restructuring of the trust assets into a joint management account, one that would give Kevin primary administrative control." The room felt very quiet. "Can he do that without me?" I asked. "No," Raymond said clearly. "Absolutely not." "Then why?" "Because," Raymond said carefully, "he may be assuming you'll sign when the authorization paperwork reaches you, or that you won't fully understand what you're signing." I thought about Kevin's voice in the living room. "She trusts me." Exactly. Raymond told me what he thought we should do. "Wait. Don't alert Kevin. Let the transfer request move through its processing stages. When the authorization arrives requiring my signature, we will respond not with panic, but with clarity." He also told me one more thing. Gerald had included a protection clause in the trust. If I, as primary beneficiary, had reasonable cause to believe the trust was being misused, I could remove Kevin as co-trustee and assume full administrative control immediately. I hadn't known that. Gerald had never told me. He had simply built it in, the way he always built backup plans into everything, quietly, without fanfare, because he believed that preparation was a form of love. I drove home in the afternoon light and sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. The house looked exactly the same as it always did. Two cars in the garage, a basketball hoop in the driveway that no one had used since September, a fall wreath on the door that Stephanie had put up the week before. Nothing was different, and yet everything felt different. I went inside. Piper was at the kitchen table with homework. June was on the couch in her dinosaur socks, watching something on the tablet. Kevin wasn't home yet. Stephanie was unloading the dishwasher. "Good lunch?" she asked. "Lovely," I said. She nodded and turned back to the cabinet. The following days were an education in paying attention. I had always considered myself observant. 31 years of reading a room full of teenagers will develop that skill. But I had stopped paying attention inside this house. I had been too busy adjusting, accommodating, making myself smaller. Now I watched. Kevin spent his evenings in the small office off the hallway. The door was usually closed. Occasionally, I heard the sound of papers being sorted or the particular clicking of someone typing something careful. Once, passing by, I heard Stephanie ask him something in a low voice and heard him answer, "The timeline is tighter than I thought. It needs to happen before year-end." Year-end. The phrase settled in my mind like a splinter. One afternoon, Piper wandered into my room after school with that particular expression teenagers get when something is bothering them, but they haven't decided whether to say it. "Grandma," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed, "is everything okay with you and Dad?" "Why would you ask that?" I said. She picked at a loose thread on my blanket. "I heard him and Mom talking the other night. They said something about money and timing and—" She looked up. "Mom said something like, 'She'll just sign it. She always does.'" I was quiet for a moment. "What did your dad say?" Piper frowned. "He didn't really say anything. I thanked her and told her everything was fine. She didn't look completely convinced, but she had the good sense not to push. That night, after I heard Kevin and Stephanie go to bed, I called Raymond. "It's coming soon," I told him, "before year-end." "Are you ready?" he asked. "I'm getting there," I said. A week later, there was an envelope on the kitchen counter when I came out for breakfast. It was thick, the kind of envelope that contains multiple pages. The return address was a financial institution in Charlotte. My name was printed clearly on the front. Kevin was already at the counter with his coffee. He looked at the envelope, then at me. "Looks like some paperwork from the account," he said. "Routine stuff." "Oh," I said. Stephanie was making the girls' lunches. She didn't look up, but her movements slowed slightly. I picked up the envelope. "I'll take a look at it later," I said. Kevin nodded. "Sure, though it's pretty straightforward. Just needs a signature." "Okay," I said, and I took it to my room. I read every page twice. Raymond had prepared me well. The document was a trust asset reallocation authorization. It requested my signature to approve the transfer of the primary trust assets into a new joint management account structure, one in which Kevin would hold sole administrative authority. At the bottom, primary beneficiary signature required. My name? A line, a space. I called Raymond. "It's here," I said. "Are you ready to have the conversation?" he asked. "I am," I said. That evening, Kevin came home from work and set his bag by the door and loosened his tie and came into the kitchen where I was sitting at the table with the opened envelope in front of me. He saw it. His step slowed almost imperceptibly. "Oh, good," he said. "You had a chance to look at it." "I did," I said. Stephanie came in from the living room as if she'd been listening for his voice. "Just needs your signature," Kevin said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, reaching for the document. I've already filled in everything. It's really just a formality. I put my hand gently on the papers before he could slide them toward me. Kevin, I said, what is this actually doing? He looked up. What do you mean? I explained. Explain it again, I said, specifically. Kevin glanced at Stephanie. It was brief, that look. A half-second calibration. It's restructuring the account, he said, making it easier to manage long-term. Easier for whom? He frowned. For everyone. I turned the document to face him and pointed to the section Raymond had shown me. This transfers administrative authority of the trust assets to you. Kevin sat back slightly. It's still your trust, but you'd control it. I'd manage it, he said. There's a difference. Stephanie stepped closer to the table. Helen, Kevin has been handling everything without complaint for over a year. This just formalizes that. I looked at her. Formalizes it. How? She hesitated. It makes the structure cleaner. Cleaner for what purpose? Neither of them answered. I was very calm. I had thought about this conversation for weeks. I had rehearsed the way I might feel, the way my voice might want to shake, and I had decided that my voice would not shake. Darrow had not built something careful and quiet to protect me so that I would shake when the moment came. I spoke with Raymond Albright, I said. The silence in the kitchen was complete. Even the refrigerator seemed to hold its breath. Kevin set down the document. When? 2 weeks ago. And again this week. Stephanie's expression shifted. Not anger exactly. Something closer to recalculation. Raymond helped Gerald set up this trust, I said. Gerald set it up without telling me the details because he knew I'd worry. But he built something in it that I think he hoped I'd never need. Kevin was looking at the table. The trust requires my written approval for any transfer of principal. Not your approval. Not a formality. Mine. I paused. Did you know that when you submitted the transfer request? Kevin looked up. His jaw was set. I thought it could be arranged. Did you know? I asked again, quietly. A long pause. Yes, he said. The honesty of it surprised me. I hadn't been certain he'd say it. Then you also knew, I said, that proceeding without my knowledge was not the same as helping me. Stephanie put a hand on Kevin's shoulder. Helen, this isn't the night I overheard you, I said. I watched both of them absorb that. In the living room, you said the account from the Richmond sale had enough. You said I didn't need to be involved in every decision. I looked at my son. And you said I trusted you. And Stephanie said exactly. Kevin closed his eyes briefly. He rubbed the back of his neck. When he looked up again, the confidence he'd walked in with was gone. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been caught setting it down. I'm behind, he said quietly. Financially. More than you know. Tell me, I said. And he did. It came out slowly at first, then faster. The Henderson account that had collapsed 6 months ago, the refinancing they'd needed to do on the house, the business line of credit they'd taken on and were struggling to service, the school tuitions, the mortgage rate adjustment, the quarterly shortfall they'd been managing by moving money from one account to another and hoping the numbers would eventually catch up. I kept thinking I'd fix it before you noticed, he said, before it became something I had to explain. You were going to use the trust to cover your debt, I said. He didn't deny it. It would have been repaid, eventually. With what? I asked. Kevin, the trust is not a credit line. It's not a backup account. Your father built it specifically so that I would never be financially dependent on anyone, not even you. Kevin looked away. His eyes were red at the edges. Dad would be furious with me. Yes, I said, he would. Stephanie had not spoken in several minutes. She was standing by the window. In the other room we could hear the sound of the television. Piper had put something on. June was probably asleep. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening with everything changed in the middle of it. "So what happens now?" Kevin asked. I picked up the document and held it for a moment. Then I set it back on the table. "I'm not signing this," I said. He nodded slowly. He'd known by then. "The trust stays exactly as your father designed it. Raymond is going to send documentation formally declining the transfer request. Your name remains as co-trustee for administrative coordination only within the original discretionary limits. Nothing changes regarding principal." Kevin rubbed his hands together. Stephanie finally turned from the window. "And the debt?" Kevin asked. "That," I said, "is something you and Stephanie will need to address together, honestly, with a financial advisor who isn't your mother." Stephanie flinched slightly. "It wasn't cruel. It was just the truth." I stood up from the table. For the first time in I couldn't remember how long, I didn't feel like the woman who'd been folding herself into the corners of someone else's house. I felt like myself. "There's one more thing," I said. Kevin looked up. "I'm going to find my own place." He started to speak and I held up a hand. "It's not a punishment. I want you to hear that clearly. I'm not leaving because I'm angry. I'm leaving because I should have done it sooner. Living here has changed things between us that didn't need to be changed. You started seeing me as something to manage, and I let that happen." I paused. "That's on both of us." Kevin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." "I know," I said. "That's the part that's complicated. You didn't plan to. It happened gradually. The way things do when nobody's paying attention." Stephanie spoke for the first time in a while. "Where will you go?" "I have resources," I said. "Raymond and I discussed options. There's a nice community in Chapel Hill. Independent living. A small apartment I can make my own. Near enough for the girls to visit on weekends." I looked at her steadily. "I'll be fine." She nodded. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before, not remorse exactly, something quieter, like a person who has just understood something about themselves that they would rather not have understood. Kevin and I finally had the conversation we should have had a year earlier. He told me more than I expected about the pressure, the embarrassment of the business setback, the way he'd convinced himself that using the trust was a temporary solution and not what it actually was. I told him about the first winter alone in Richmond, about the night the furnace stopped working and I sat in 3 sweaters waiting for the repairman and didn't call him because I didn't want to be a burden. We had both, it turned out, been protecting each other from the truth, and the truth had found a way through anyway. I moved into the Chapel Hill apartment in January. It was smaller than anything I had lived in since my 20s. 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen, windows that faced a courtyard with a pair of oak trees. I bought a new reading chair, green, slightly impractical, and I put it by the window and I sat in it the first morning with a cup of coffee and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Settled. In myself. The girls come on Sundays when their parents bring them. Piper is teaching me something on her phone that I don't fully understand but appreciate the effort. June has decided the apartment needs a plant, and she is not wrong, so we are choosing one together next weekend. Kevin calls twice a week now. The conversations are longer. Less careful. Last month he told me they'd engaged a financial counselor and were working through the debt in a structured way. He didn't sound embarrassed saying it. He sounded relieved. Gerald would have said, "I told you so," quietly, in his way, and then helped Kevin work through the numbers because that's the man he was. Prepared for the worst, hopeful for better, building things to last. I think about that a lot. The way Gerald built something he never fully explained because he believed in protection as a form of love. He didn't doubt Kevin, he simply understood what pressure does to people over time, and he made sure that whatever happened, I would always have a foundation no one could quietly rearrange. There are things I want you to know. If you're watching this and any part of my story sounds familiar, Your love for your children does not require your silence. Helping someone for years does not make you responsible for their choices. And dignity is not something you can be asked to hand over, even to family, even kindly, even gradually. The moment you realize that is the moment everything starts to become clear. Gerald called me every day for 31 years. He couldn't do that anymore, but in his careful, methodical, unromantic way, he left something behind that spoke louder than a phone call. He left me protected, and when the moment came, I was ready. If any part of this touched you, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Sometimes just knowing someone else is listening is enough. Thank you for being here. I've thought a lot about what made Kevin believe he could do what he did. And I don't think it was greed. Not exactly. I think it was something quieter and more common than that. He looked at me and saw someone diminished. A woman who had lost her husband, sold her home, moved into a spare bedroom, and spent a year asking permission to run the washing machine. He saw someone who had slowly, without realizing it, given away her authority. And he concluded, reasonably enough given the evidence, that I would keep giving it away. That's on me. Not the part where he submitted the transfer request. That was his choice, and choices have weight. But the part where I made it easy for him to see me that way, I did that. I was so determined not to be a burden that I became something worse, invisible. And when you make yourself invisible, people stop accounting for you in their plans. What I understand now is that accommodation without limit is not kindness. It looks like kindness. It feels like it, for a while. But there's a point where making yourself smaller stops being gracious and starts being a slow surrender of everything that makes you a person with a life of your own. I crossed that line somewhere in the first few months in that house, and I didn't notice because I was too busy telling myself I was lucky. Gerald noticed. That's what still moves me, even now, sitting in my green chair by the window. He saw something I couldn't see about my own future, and instead of saying it out loud, because he knew I would wave it away, tell him he was being dramatic, change the subject, he simply built something, quietly, methodically, the way he built everything. He left me protected not because he thought Kevin was dangerous, but because he understood that good intentions, under enough pressure, can bend in directions no one planned. That's not cynicism. That's just honesty about what pressure does. Kevin wasn't a villain. He was a man in over his head who looked for solution in the wrong direction. The cause of what happened was real financial stress meeting the assumption that I wasn't paying attention. And the effect was a moment at a kitchen table where I had to decide who I was going to be. I chose to be the woman Gerald believed I was. Not because of him, I want to be clear about that, but because I finally decided to believe it myself. Tracing it back now, I can see every step. The smaller I made myself, the more natural it seemed to others to make decisions without me. The less I questioned, the more certain everyone became that I wouldn't. That's the chain. Silence invites assumption. Assumption invites action. And action, once it's far enough along, is hard to undo without a confrontation that nobody wanted. The confrontation was hard, but it was also clarifying in a way that nothing else in that year had been. Because when I put my hand on those papers and said Kevin's name, I stopped being the woman in the spare bedroom and became myself again. The English teacher who spent 31 years looking teenagers in the eye and telling them that the most important thing you'll ever learn is how to read carefully. Read carefully. Know what you're agreeing to. Don't sign anything you don't understand. I should have taken my own lessons sooner, but I took it when it mattered, and that's enough.